Hello, this is Yeshua said my name. In an article from LaCroix International, and I will leave a link for you down in the description section of the video, LaCroix International stated, hinting the resignation of Pope Francis. The question is not if he will resign, but when he will actually do so. This article came out on February the 8th, 2019 in Rome, Vatican City. Now, Francis is quoted on an airplane coming back from the UAE with his ecumenical visit there and signing of that document. It states here in the article, the anniversary of Benedict's resignation announcement and speculation over whether Pope Francis intends to be the second consecutive Roman pontiff to retire came to mind this past week when the current pope held a press conference on his flight home from a visit to the UAE. While responding to a reporter's question, Francis said he had received invitations to visit other Arab countries. But, Francis said, quote, "There's no time this year." He said, "Let's see if next year I or another Peter," and he said, "Pope, will go," he said. So not if, but when. The comment was not meant to be a cryptic message. In fact, Francis, like his predecessors, often has been cautious not to make definitive promises he'll attend events that are months or years away, conscious of his own mortality. Nevertheless, there have been signs since the very beginning of his pontificate that the question is not if Francis will resign, but more likely when he will actually do so. Now, it's interesting that Francis said, if I or another pope will go sometime next year. And when this article came out and said the resignation of Pope Francis, not if, but when, and this came out just a couple of days ago on February the 8th, 2019. So that brings me to a scripture. Let me see if I can get this up for you. In Revelation 17:11, I'll quote it for you first, and then I'll get on to my commentary about this article relating to the scripture. "And the beast that was and is not, even he is the eighth and is of the seven, and goeth into perdition." Now, John was being shown, while he was on the island of Patmos, he was being shown a revelation from the angel bringing a message to John about the papal reign. Now, Revelation 17 is strictly focusing on modern-day Vatican City State, and so is Revelation 18. So the fact that this is in Revelation 17 and the whole chapter references modern Vatican City State, this is interesting. Now, in 1929, the Lateran Treaty was signed, and there were papers that came out in 1929 stating the mortal wound of the papacy had been healed. If you Google this, you can find these newspaper articles stating such a thing. When you read mortal wound healed, it's almost like you're reading from the book of Daniel. I mean, it's amazing. This beast that was and is not at the time was in her wilderness experience at the time John got this revelation. She had been mortally wounded and was in a wilderness experience, the angel was telling John. And during the 1929 Lateran Treaty, Vatican City State, or the papal throne, was revived after what seemed like a mortal wound. And it says the whole world marveled after the beast. How could this have happened? How could she have come back, or this dynasty of popes return from such a mortal wound / wilderness experience? Now, when Benedict resigned, I had often thought to myself, could it be that he was of the seven, because the seventh reign did not end? Notice here in Scripture, it states that the final pope, or the final king at the time of the coming of the Lord, will be an eighth king, but will be of the seven. Usually a pope dies, leaving the successive reign to a brand new pope, stating, okay, this is the fifth reign, this is the sixth reign, this is the seventh. So when Benedict resigned, instead of dying in order to leave from office, technically, and this is just my opinion, Francis took over the seventh reign, even though he is an eighth king, since the 1929 Lateran Treaty. Isn't this interesting? Now, I've done some research on this, and when I came across this article about Pope Francis hinting that he could be resigning, and now, this news is coming out even in credible news sources, it made me wonder about this writing in Revelation 17:11 about the eighth king being of the seven. It's easy to see how Benedict could be the seventh king, and then how Francis coming in could be of the seven, even though he's an eighth king. Well, that's easy, simply because Benedict did not die, leaving Francis to be the actual successor and the eighth king. Francis, in my opinion, is still finishing out the seventh reign. Because Benedict did not die, he resigned. Francis took over his pontificate, which means, in my opinion, and this is just my opinion, that Francis is still fulfilling the seventh king's reign, even though he's an eighth. So that's what I think this cryptic messages in Revelation here is that he's an eighth king, even though he's of the seven. And I used to ponder that, thinking, Lord, how can he be the eighth king if he's of the seven? And then the Lord told me that Benedict did not die, he resigned. So when Francis took over, he is an eighth king, but he's still finishing the seventh reign. He's of the seven because Benedict is still alive. Now, what if Francis resigns while Benedict is still alive? Where does that put us in this? And I've been pondering that ever since I read this article from LaCroix a couple of days ago. Same thing applies. When it says here he's an eighth king, but he's of the seven could mean one or two or three successive popes who have simply resigned instead of dying while in office. Now, this is just opinion on my part. Please give me your feedback on this. I'm not 100% convinced, but I'm simply bouncing this off of you to see where you stand. Could it be that if Francis resigns, we're still looking at another eighth, even though he's of the seven? Could it be that Benedict, he is still of the seventh reign, and so is Francis, finishing out the seventh reign simply because Benedict did not die? What if Francis resigns and we have an eighth king who is still of the seven that are still living? Just food for thought. I'd be anxious to hear your thoughts down in the comment section. Could it be that Pope Francis will resign? Only the Lord knows that. Could there be another eighth king who is of the seven, even though there are two Pope Emerituses possibly in the future? Maybe. The Lord keeps us seeking him daily, if not yearly, about these things. But the 1929 Lateran Treaty brought the Roman papacy back from death, basically, from its mortal wound. And there are newspapers from that time stating such a fact, that she had recovered from her mortal wound. And the whole world marveled after the beast, wondering, how did this happen? And John was shown 8 kings from the time of the 1929 Lateran Treaty until the coming of Christ. And the 8th king would be the one when the Lord comes back and goes into perdition. Could it be that when Benedict resigned and Francis took his place, Francis is simply finishing out Benedict's reign, making Francis an 8th king, but of the 7th reign? Could it be that if Francis resigned and we had another 8th king that is still of the 7, even if we had 2 that were still alive, even though they resigned, this scripture could still hold true? Just food for thought, something I thought I'd bring to your attention. I thought it was prophetically significant and something worth mentioning. But in case you hadn't heard, there are rumors in the news that Pope Francis could resign. What does that mean prophetically? Well, let's continue to study Revelation 17:11. See what the Lord brings you. God bless you. More to come soon. Thank you for listening.